A few years ago, after I'd left college and wasn't really ready to become a career adult yet, I took a job working as a fry cook at a local fast food restaurant. It wasn't a chain restaurant, it was one of those where the signage and font try and make it look like it's KFC or something, but it obviously isn't. And everything from the hygiene to the menu to the prices make it clear that it's knockoff, and people freaking love these places. Fried chicken and fries for $1 cheaper than KFC? Hell yeah, sign me up. And so it was actually rewarding work. I didn't get paid much, but I was pushing my body to the limit while at the same time I was doing a long-term master's degree, so it felt like a really productive member of society, and I don't know why I'm justifying all of this to you. And if you want to spend your entire damn life working fast food, more power to you. The world would be an inferior place if we couldn't just go to our local McDaniel's or Arkansas Fried Chicken or Out and About Burger or, the official ones. Now anyways, the point is, I'm not really sure how the hygiene and waste disposal and official things work in the big brand franchise restaurants. What I do know is that at the little local owned store that I worked at, which I'm just going to call Bugger Kong, things worked in a very certain way. And one of those ways was we had a big metal oil drum out back where we'd dump the used oil from the fryer when it was time to change it. And then we just kind of left the barrel alone until it got full enough to get one of the guys to haul it to God knows wherever it was that they disposed of a big old barrel of vegetable oil. I should also mention that while the barrel had a lid, it was kind of just placed on there. Just enough so it didn't fill the barrel with rain and cause us to have to take disposal trips early. But if someone had wanted to go into the barrel, then they could pretty easily. But why the heck would anyone want to go into a barrel of used, dirty cooking oil? It's not like there was any good reason to keep it under lock and key, right? It was out back, in the chain fenced-off area with the dumpsters and all other types of gross crap. So I was General Chick Who Does Whatever Needs Doing as my official title. Go-To Georgie, they called me, because, well, my name's Georgia, and people would come to me whenever some crap needed doing. Short of staff on the front counter? Ask Georgie. Need puke mopped up from the floor in the tiny seating area? Yep, me. But my main job there, which I was damn good at for what the job entailed, was fry cook. I flipped a burger meaner than a dad with a midlife crisis and a kiss the cook apron on. And I had more than one customer, always middle-aged men who liked the cut of my uniform, jib, tell me that they liked coming in best when I was on the grill. And yeah, look, I was a sassy, fairly hot postgrad working in a grungy fast food restaurant. I've seen Kevin Smith movies, and I know it makes me look cool to play up to this. Sue me. And if you want to picture me, at least back then, I looked a bit like that chick who's the singer of Linkin Park now, but in my early 20s, with more piercings and a singing voice that'd make your ears bleed. And I know none of this is massively relevant, but I want you to have the perfect picture of the scene just so it makes sense when I perfectly, in minute and explicit detail, describe the visuals of what happened that day. You'll thank me, trust me. So one day, I've been working the griddle all day and I was just about DWTS, done with this crap, but I used to say it like that to A, make me sound cool, and B, avoid getting scolded by my very sweet Christian mother. And so of course, right at the end of my shift, just as the sun was about to set, my manager Karen, yes, their actual name, who never liked me, told me that I had to haul my butt out into the back lot, lugging that oil with me and dump it in the barrel. Oh, and that should be the last of it, so I had to call on the boys to come collect it in the morning. And sure, they're gonna love that. And there's a way that you drain the oil of our fryers that lets you drain the oil into 5-gallon buckets. Thankfully, it was all cooled by now because the fryer hadn't been used for a while, so it was safe to drain the first 5-gallon bucket and strain my whole entire butt, dragging it out the back door backwards. And as soon as I got outside into the little chained-off backyard that served as our exterior area, I knew something was wrong. I'd spent plenty of time out here on my cigarette breaks, and it always stank, but this time it stank to high heaven. So I placed the oil bucket down in front of the back door to stop it slamming shut, and I turned around to see exactly what had caused our garbage area to stink worse than Satan's taint. First thing I saw was rotten food just sort of strewn all over the ground. The wild thing here is our dumpster had been emptied that morning, so there was no way that the rotten food had come from our restaurant. Someone had brought it here, and that someone, well, it was pretty clear who she was. And the first thing I noted was a shopping cart, adorned with all types of trinkets and decorations like you often see homeless folks pushing around. And then I saw the presumably homeless lady herself, and she was, I kid you not, in the oil barrel. She was absolutely covered in weeks of old, filthy cooking oil. She hadn't seen me looking, and as I watched, she ducked into the barrel and submerged herself in the liquid. I actually counted. She was down in that oil for 45 seconds, and then she burst out, letting out a gasp of what I can only describe as ecstasy. Her mouth was thrown wide open, cooking oil pouring from her mouth, and then she saw me. She spat a wad of cooking oil straight at me, thankfully nowhere near close enough to hit me, but still I backed away. And did I mention that this woman was extremely, depressingly old and also extremely naked? I could only see her bare, saggy chest at this point, but I later saw the full glory of her nudity, so I can say with confidence that she was naked, diving in our oil barrel. Despite what I said, I'm not going to go into detail describing an emaciated, sore-ridden octogenarian covered in cooking oil coming bursting out of the barrel. You can probably imagine what that looks like. But when she saw me and spat the oil at me, it was like a switch flipped in her brain. Maybe it was the shame of getting caught taking an oil bath surrounded by rotten food, but I doubt it. She did, however, start absolutely shrieking at me and pointing a very gnarled accusatory finger. If it had been the 1690s, then I would have been straight up on WhatsApp to the latest witch finder, telling them that we had some witch burning to do. But alas, this was 2023 at the time, so all I was able to do was kind of back away and say, "Hey lady, chill out. You just can't stay in our barrel of oil." And the oil lady started thrashing, shrieking about this, and I could tell what was going to happen. She was angrily reaching out towards me, flailing with rage and fury, so of course, yes, the entire barrel of oil tumbled forward, sending foul-smelling vegetable oil flooding across the lot. I tried to jump back further but hit the wall. In my infinite wisdom, I decided to kick the bucket. Not in that way, but I mean the bucket that was propping the door open. I didn't want any of this crap getting into the kitchen and giving Karen an excuse to Karen at me. And the barrel of oil managed to topple forward towards this woman, and the back door of the restaurant slammed shut, i.e. locked. And this meant that I was trapped with this oil woman in a small fenced-in area. Another thing I noticed was that the oil barrel appeared to be filled with more rotting food, and we certainly hadn't been putting it in there, and I had this horrible feeling from the state of it that the old woman had taken the food into the barrel with her and had been eating it underwater. Well, under oil, I guess. The ancient oil-covered naked woman was crawling across the asphalt toward me, occasionally trying to get her feet and then slipping each time. Now I was torn. What the hell did I do? I felt bad for this clearly mentally ill old lady homeless person covered in cooking oil and chowing down on rotten garbage, but she was also crawling towards me like some kind of disgusting fetish weirdo from the garage, and from the look on her face, she had slippery murder in mind. The fact that she was screaming at me, calling me a witch and saying that she was going to tear my insides out and fill my hoo-ha with oil wasn't exactly filling me with charity towards helping this lunatic either. And so I did maybe the most epic move of my life. I ran around the oil spill, aiming for the dumpster. I was going to climb on the top, but then leap over the 8-foot chain fence, leaving this woman trapped inside the lot, and then I'd go around the front of the restaurant and call the cops. This was mostly a good idea, except I misjudged how fast the oil woman could slide across the ground in her oily nakedness, and I was almost at the dumpster when she grabbed my ankle, her slippery hands trying to drag me into the slimy puddle that she was rolling in. Hell no, I was having none of this, and so I did probably the worst thing that I'd ever have to do in my life. I stamped on an 80-plus-year-old woman's wrist. I wasn't proud of it, but it worked, and she howled and let go. Now listen, if you saw her, if you saw how clearly strong and weird this woman was despite her age, then you wouldn't judge me. Hell, for all I know, she was in her 40s and just aged really badly from meth or some other drugs. So, as she rolled around in pain, I knocked her stupid, dumb shopping cart out of the way and threw myself on top of the dumpster and took the leap of my life to expertly vault over the chain link fence. The oil coating my sneakers and hands didn't quite allow this plan to come to pass, and I almost managed it. Instead, my pants caught on the chain link fence and I was left hanging upside down, blissfully on the outside of the yard, but somehow caught by the tear in my knee of my jeans, so I was just sort of hanging there upside down. And there was a moment where I was considering that I could undo my belt and slip out of my pants and fall to the ground in my underwear, but there was already a naked elderly lady in gallons of oil. There was no way that I was turning this into more of an effed up, weird concept than it already was. And instead, I shamelessly and tearfully started screaming for help. Thankfully, a passerby saw me and helped me down, and then recoiled in absolute horror when they saw the scene that I just escaped from. Now, short ending to a long story, I limped my way back to the restaurant while this passerby very kindly kept an eye out on the old woman just in case she found some way to try and escape. And how she'd gotten in, shopping cart included, was absolutely beyond me, and the best I could think is that she'd picked the padlock to the yard and then for some reason locked it behind her again. It didn't feel like this was the first time that she'd taken a bath in our oil. It felt almost too planned. Now Karen handled it, called the cops, and I gave a statement, and then got sent home for the day. I never really found out much about that old lady. All I knew was that she definitely wasn't pressing charges, and she was getting the help that she needed, so I guess that was nice. Now listen, I tried to make this sound as funny as possible, but the whole thing was absolutely freaking terrifying, and the only way that I can handle the story is really by joking about it. I still have genuine nightmares about her bursting out of that barrel, oil pouring from mouth and screaming just gibberish at me. I still get sick if I smell anything rotting, and I absolutely do not work in fast food anymore. I just can't. And I know the event could have happened anywhere with a drum of oil, I guess, but I can't handle the idea of ever encountering anything like that again. I mean, could you? No matter how I try and turn this into comedy, it's the most horrifying thing I've ever dealt with, and I hope to all that is holy that I never, ever have a reason to share a story like this ever again. But you know, if you want to use a terrifying woman bursting out of an oil drum as the video thumbnail, I think that I'd probably be okay with that. Maybe. At least something positive could come from this absolute crap show. When I was around 18, myself and my now husband went out to a fancy restaurant for dinner. We live in a small rural town, so the restaurant was one of those which is out in the middle of nowhere and pretty exclusive. Now this was many years ago, and my husband's father was kind of somebody in our small town, so we managed to get a booking. Now we turned up at around 8 and were seated, and as an 18-year-old girl who grew up poor, I felt like a darn celebrity. As the restaurant was filled with other diners, mostly middle-aged, upper-class folks who definitely looked like they belonged there. And I felt a bit like a fish out of water, but I guess this is why I was so relieved when the couple seated beside us struck up a conversation. They were clearly rich and well-to-do. The one was one of those glamorous old women who look like they're the murderous widow in some drama. And the husband, though, he clearly had done pretty well for himself and clearly enjoyed doing well for himself. His fingers were very swollen and his nose was red with these sort of burst blood vessels. And he had a very well-groomed and well-trimmed white beard and this balding head, but there were nicotine stains on his teeth and facial hair that I could see, and this was back in the days before teeth whitening made every rich person look like they had immaculate dental hygiene. I don't remember what we chatted about, and frankly, I didn't care. It was pleasant and fun, though, and they made us feel extremely welcome. Well, they made me feel welcome anyway. My husband was more used to attending higher-class restaurants like this with his family. And speaking of my husband, he stepped outside for a cigarette break. You could smoke inside restaurants back then, but we always opted to sit in the no-smoking section, because even back then it was pretty disgusting to eat your dinner surrounded by other people's secondhand smoke. My husband would typically spend about 10 minutes on a cigarette break before a meal, as he'd have a couple beforehand so he could go until after dessert for the next one. Food used to take between 30 minutes to an hour to arrive from the kitchen back then, and it was considered totally normal to wait for your meal for that long, so this was his first cigarette break. Now, a minute or so after my husband stepped outside, this rich wife excused herself to powder her nose, and I just sat there sort of playing with my cutlery and giving the rich husband a polite smile every now and then because I couldn't help notice that he was kind of looking at me a lot. And then the rich husband looked around the restaurant, leaned across the table towards me and whispered, "I love you." And then he sat back in his seat and loudly began to talk about how great this place was and said hi to another nearby group who were dining that he clearly knew. And it was so bizarre, and I almost wondered if I'd actually misheard it. I looked over my shoulder and saw my husband outside smoking, and I tried to catch his eye. Nothing doing there. Now, the wife still wasn't back from the bathroom yet, and this husband took a sip of wine, which stained his teeth red, and then he leaned towards me again and whispered, "I love you," and then went back to acting normally. His wife returned from the bathroom. My husband returned from his smoke break. 3 more times that evening, I ended up alone with this rich husband. At no point did I manage to end up alone with my husband to tell him what was going on, though. I was alone with the rich wife at one point, but she was engaged in conversation with a group of old ladies 2 tables over, and on top of that, I just felt too nervous to bring it up with her. Remember, I was literally just 18. I grew up poor, and I was surrounded by people who I could easily imagine eating someone like me just for the thrill of it. And the next time I was alone with that rich husband, he did the same thing 3 more times. Leaned in and whispered, "I love you," and then sat back with a sort of satisfied smile on his face. The second time, there were 2 "I love yous" and 1 "I really love you." Now, I was bracing myself for things to start turning weirder. You could tell from the way he was looking me up and down that pure romantic love was not exactly what he meant by his words. And the third time it was, "I love you," and then "I really love you," and then glancing around the restaurant to check nobody was looking. He directed his, and thus my, gaze to the tabletop at his waist. And I couldn't see anything, obviously, but the way the tablecloth was bunched up and the way his arm had disappeared beneath the table, he was definitely giving the impression that he was squeezing himself down there. And then he leaned across, and in the most weird and creepy whisper yet, he said it again. "I love you." And then conveniently, his wife got back to the table, and he started telling her about something that had happened at the office that he'd forgotten to tell her about, but absolutely positively had to share with her. And I just felt frozen, sick, and scared. I had no idea what to do. And of course, I had unpleasant experiences with men before as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenage girl, but you kind of expected to avoid that type of thing in this very high-end restaurant when your partner and his wife were so present. And to top it all off, I felt way too concerned about embarrassing my husband to be in front of his people. He knew some of the other diners, if not this couple themselves, and other than the weird "I love yous," the conversation with the couple had been entirely pleasant and, dare I say, even enjoyable. I would have happily befriended them if not for this creepy weirdness that was coming out of the guy. And as it happened, and at the time I believed it to be a coincidence, we finished our meal at the same time as the older couple, both paid at the same time, and both made to leave at once. My husband paid on his credit card, but the rich wife was the one to handle their bill. The rich husband sort of sidled up next to me, and I sort of froze, terrified of what he was going to say next. Instead of saying anything lewd, he just simply said it would be absolutely charming to meet myself and my partner, and perhaps we could officially dine together at some point. And then he gave me his business card. And yes, it was one that Patrick Bateman would have scoffed at, in case you're wondering. But the point is, not only did he give me his business card, but it had his home telephone number on it. The rich husband and rich wife sort of walked us to our car, and as I climbed into the passenger seat, he said, "Remember what I told you?" And when my husband looked at him sort of confused, he said that he suggested that we all dine out together again, and I had their card. But I know that's not what he meant, though. I knew that he meant the I love yous. So that was my creepy first encounter where rich people go to dine. Was it really scary? Well, not yet, but believe it or not, this was the prelude. On the drive home, I told my husband to be everything. He is a very calm and peaceful and spiritual man. But back when we were both 18, as he's just 3 months older than me, he was, well, let's just say pretty hot-headed and protective of me in a way that verged on jealousy. And now he was so angry that he almost steered the car off the road. But I made him swear to keep him calm and listen to me and promise that he wouldn't turn that car around or pull in and wait for the couple to pass so he could chase them down or anything stupid like that. And to his credit, he agreed with me. And then I got to the final bit, and I told him that I had the guy's business card. Now he smiled quietly, and then when we got home, he asked me to give him the business card. And I lived with him at his mom and stepdad's house for reasons I won't go into. They were pretty bohemian about it since we were technically together before marriage. And I gave him the card after he swore me 2 things. 1, that he wouldn't do anything for a few days until we had time to think about it, and 2, he wouldn't just go around to their house, which we discovered was almost this sort of stately home. And when we swore to both, I gave him the business card. And what my husband did should have been the perfect revenge. It should have absolutely effed things up for the rich husband and revealed him for the weirdo that he is. But it didn't, and that's what creeps me out the most. What my husband did was call up the number and ask to speak to the rich wife, and it was her that he confronted. He told her all about her husband's harassment of me, and he may have embellished a little even because screw it, but he made it very clear that her husband had been trying to behave creepily towards me and hinted that I should contact him for some kind of encounter. I was listening in on the other line, as that's how landlines work those days, and I was completely chilled when I heard the rich wife start laughing in a very cold and callous way. Now my husband-to-be kept on ranting about how uncomfortable the creepy old dude had made me, and maybe she wasn't grasping the fact that he intended to cheat on her. And this rich wife said something like, "Are you finished?" He only told her that he loved her. Gareth can be a bit much sometimes, she says. And then it hit me. Pretty much every time I'd been alone with that rich husband, my own husband had left first, and then rich wife had found an excuse to take an extended break from the table and always ensured that I was alone with her husband. Then she said one final thing that I'll never forget, which creeped me out more than any way rich husband, aka this Gareth, had made me feel. She said to my husband that maybe he should stop taking things so seriously and take them up on their offer of dinner today, and that she was sure a couple of our means would appreciate being able to dine with the likes of them, and we both looked like our company could help rejuvenate their marriage. Now there was no doubt about it then. They were goddamn predatory swingers, maybe worse, who thought that we were just some young poor couple spending what little we had at some swanky restaurant. My husband had a tendency to dress down because he had the whole embarrassed rich kid thing, so it made some sense. And so my husband, keeping calm, said thank you for the invite, and maybe he'd check in with his father because perhaps he was familiar and maybe we could all dine together as a family. As soon as rich wife had heard my husband's father's name, she responded rather quickly that maybe we'd have to see, but perhaps it was best that we took a rain check, and then she hung up. And that was just about the one time when my husband was actually to use his birth father's reputation in our small town to scare this pair of creeps. And you can probably imagine the type of rich character my father-in-law was, given that the very mention of his name caused a pair of very creepy, probably even murderous swingers to back off in fear. But that, my friends, is a very much different story. In my very early 20s, I was a waitress at a small family-owned chain in my hometown. There wasn't anything particularly notable about the restaurant. It was pretty beloved in my town, and the food was great quality. Man, our chefs were chef's kiss. And in the evenings, it had this lovely mood lighting that made the place feel incredibly romantic, even if it was a bit dark at times. I got the job after dining there with my then boyfriend, Jono, for around the fifth time, and he noticed a help wanted sign in the window. It seemed like a perfect fit since I was looking for a job for my last couple of years of college, and I already knew a bunch of the restaurant staff, either through dining there or because I was friends with a couple of the waitresses. Things went great for the first few months there. I was having a blast and genuinely enjoying the work while still finding time for my studies. Unfortunately, working at the restaurant led to a little turmoil in my life as well. There was a male coworker who I'd become good friends with, purely platonic, but my boyfriend couldn't be convinced to see it that way. And one day he turned up at closing time to catch me and my coworker Brandon at it. By at it, in this case, he meant Brandon was walking me to my car in the dark, something he did every time we worked the night shift because, well, I don't need to explain why a male friend might do that for a female friend, do I? Unfortunately, my boyfriend couldn't quite grasp this concept, and he absolutely lost his goddamn mind. He accused Brandon of trying to steal his girl, and then started screaming in the parking lot about all types of these STDs I had. Now, it didn't stop there either. He started coming into the restaurant during busy evening hours, pointing at me and yelling to everyone that I was a, well, loose woman, and that even more embarrassing, he was deciding that to start sharing very intimate, very true facts about my body that were just kind of things that you don't want diners at a restaurant or your colleagues to hear about, you know? It was horrible, having someone show up out of the blue to randomly yell something unpleasant about how one of my breasts was smaller than the other and I was insecure about it, or the kind of things I liked in bed. And my now ex-boyfriend was banned from the restaurant, and I was given a couple of weeks of compassionate leave. During this time, I got a restraining order filed against him, and the security camera footage from the restaurant as well as witness testimony made it pretty simple and easy of a process. But still, I was devastated. I felt like I had no choice but to quit my job because the longer I stayed, the more sick that I felt about going back to face everyone. And eventually Brandon gave me a much-needed pep talk and convinced me that I was super valued as an employee and that they'd be gutted to lose me. And his well-meaning guilt trip worked, and I eventually returned to work. And now, enter the third player in the story. His name was Howie, and he was the assistant manager of our little family. Up until this point, Howie had been polite but distant with me. Not rude or anything, but not particularly interested in me as anything more than a colleague either. And on the day that I returned to work, though, he called me into his office and told me that Jono would not be darkening the door of our establishment again, and that he'd personally make sure of it. I wasn't sure how he could promise that since it would require him to work the exact same shifts as me, which surely he wouldn't be doing. But it turns out I was wrong. He'd arranged things so we worked at exactly the same times, at all times, and that was just the first red flag. The next, which I should have taken more seriously, was when he called me into his office again a few days later and started addressing the horrible things Jono had said about me. He said that he knew that I didn't have STDs, Jonah claimed, because I obviously wasn't that type of girl, which isn't how STDs work, buddy, but I liked my job and wanted to keep it, so I just kept quiet on that. Now next, he started talking about how I shouldn't be insecure about my breasts. So what if one of them was smaller than the other? He'd never noticed, and in fact, he thought they looked great. And he took this as an opportunity to gesture and stare at my chest as if he was doing me a favor. And then, the third and most intolerable red flag, there had been a certain proclivity that Jono had repeatedly yelled that I was into in front of colleagues and customers. Nothing I think anyone should be ashamed of, but not something that a young woman particularly once broadcasted to coworkers and strangers. And Howie reassured me repeatedly that it was fine that I was into this particular thing. And then he started telling me about how one of his current girlfriends, yep, phrased just like that, was also into it, and she told him that he was really good at pleasing her in that manner. And then he sort of paused as if waiting for me to respond with, I don't know. A request to experience this, I guess. The man was in his goddamn 40s, by the way, and surely he knew that that wouldn't work. And so now, I'd gone from one surprise abusive ex to a surprise creepy boss. They always say bad luck comes in threes, right? And so that night, at a bar after work, I got a bit tipsy and told Brandon everything. Brandon, who'd rapidly become my best friend, who I thought I could trust with anything. In his response, I probably misinterpreted Howie. That Howie was a good guy, he'd known him for years, and he'd never behaved like that towards him. Now just imagine me yelling loudly and incoherently at this point. So that was just me done with that job, but not before Howie had one final trick up his sleeve. Again, he called me into his office and this time made me sit on his side of the desk, which I reluctantly did because as much as it sickened me, I needed to part on good terms so I could get the references I needed. Now I couldn't believe what I was seeing when Howie pulled up the folder on his computer. It was a series of photos of Jono taken with a telephoto lens, like they'd been snapped by some kind of private detective, and they chronicled his daily movements since we'd broken up. Now I stared at Howie, who looked at me like he was extremely proud of himself, and he went on to explain that now we had a good enough data on Jono's day-to-day activities that we could surely make it look like an accident. Make what look like an accident, I asked. But of course I already knew. Howie had it in his head that together we were going to kill Jono to restore my honor, and then what? I dropped my panties for this balding middle management a-hole because he roped me into committing murder? Now I told him that I severely appreciated the effort he'd gone to and asked him if he could just email his dossier over to me so I could spend the night coming up with a plan. And that buffoon actually did it. He emailed me the photos, his random, barely legible .txt documents about how we could hit Howie with a car or cause him to walk under some unstable structures, or all manner of Looney Tunes nonsense. But his most coherent idea by far was that we'd invite him to the restaurant under the guise of me wanting to get back together with him and then serve him poisoned food. I immediately called the cops and forwarded all the information. Thankfully, they took it extremely seriously and apprehended Howie that same night on intention to commit murder. Eventually, he entered into some kind of plea deal and it was proven that he was most definitely not of sound mind, and really I didn't care as long as he got the help that he needed and wasn't a danger to others. But for me, I was left pretty devastated. First Jono, then Howie, then Brandon. I didn't really have any close female friends, so it just felt to me like everybody I'd gotten close to had turned out to be a goddamn psychopath. And honestly, I'm still struggling to shed that belief. I'm in therapy, but every time I meet a new person, every time they're nice to me, I find myself gripped with the terror of waiting for the other shoe to drop, as they say. All because I followed up on the help wanted sign in the window of my favorite local restaurant. They say you are what you eat. But frankly, I do not remember crazy being on the menu. My first job at a restaurant did not last all that long. I messed up, and I messed up big. It was a small Greek restaurant, all low-light mood lighting and authentic music. The owner, Mr. Tavaloris, was a larger-than-life character who could be the friendliest, funniest guy in the world unless he was in one of his moods, and then merely being in the restaurant felt like life or death. A couple of weeks into my work there, I was a waiter. Mr. Tavalorius came to me and told me inexplicably that I'd be in charge of front of the house. Not only that, it was going to be a quiet night, so I'd be the only waitstaff on hand, and to call his brother if things got out of hand and I needed a hand. Alternatively, if we had no diners arrive by 9 p.m., I was to shut up shop early, send the sole member of the kitchen staff home, and then hang around until my shift ended at 11, cleaning up and keeping an eye on the place. I didn't really like the sound of this, so I politely asked why I needed to stick around. Tavalorius told me that a guy might be dropping by, but don't worry, he was a professional, and I'd know what was up when I met him. Now this was classic Mr. T. He liked to turn everything into an epic mystery saga. I'm not sure if he had a poor grasp of the English language or just liked to pretend he did. And there was a rumor circulating some years later that he wasn't even Greek and had ever even been to Europe. And having worked for the man even for a couple of weeks, I honestly could believe this. 9 p.m. came and went, and we hadn't had a single customer all night. I sent the chef, an extremely young woman by the name of Maria, home early and went about doing God knows what, and I set the sign to closed, did a half-assed job of cleaning up the already immaculate restaurant, and ended up playing my Game Boy Color. Now, this was back in those days. Now, near 10 p.m., there was an urgent knock at the front door. I paused whatever game I was playing and headed over to alert the potential customer that, sorry, we'd closed, and no, I didn't know why, but them's were the breaks. And then I remembered that Tavalorius had told me to expect a guy, and it was pretty clear looking through the glass door that this was the guy that I'd be expecting. It was an exterminator, all kitted out in gear, and I could see his purple van parked back over in the handicap spot, and that the guy had a hand-rolled cigarette hanging between his lips. The label on his jumpsuit read, Roach a Go-Go. It was cute, so I just let him in. He told me in a thick Serbian accent that I had been expecting him. Didn't ask, just told. And I was like, sure, buddy, you're the guy, right? And he seemed to like this, declaring that yes, he was the guy, and he had a problem to take care of for Tavaloris before things got out. The exterminator told me that he had to go work in the kitchen, and this kind of unnerved me because what the hell did we have living in our kitchen? I asked him and he said not to worry, it was preventative. That Tavaloris' bosses didn't like the idea of rats in their establishment. I didn't even know Tavaloris had a boss. I'd always assumed that he owned the restaurant, but hey, I guess this all made sense. And so the exterminator headed through, and maybe my alarm bell should have rang when all he took in with him was a huge black plastic crate that he held by a handle. But what the heck did I know about extermination and laying poison or rat traps? The guy wasn't in the kitchen too long. He quickly stepped out of the door, too quickly, I realized much later, and then clicked the latch shut. The fella told me that I should just go home and leave the kitchen overnight for the poison to settle and deter any rats. None of this seemed weird to me, and Tavaloris had basically told me the same thing, to go home early, so I ushered the roaches a go-go to his van and bid him a good night and got into my own battered Buick 8, my pride and joy. Now, I'm just going to jump ahead a little here and explain something about what Tavaloris actually intended by having me stay alone at the restaurant. Now, he was expecting some very angry guys to show up and punish him for some transgression or other because, shock and horror, my dodgy Greek boss was in with the mob. Gasp. Who could have seen that coming? And so what he figured, I think, was that this mob boss's thugs would find me there alone, figured that I might be a big deal to Tavaloris, and dish out a beating that I wouldn't soon forget. At least I hope he only expected a beating. The idea that I was being cast out as a sacrificial lamb is a little too terrifying to actually consider. The thing is, these mob guys were smart, smarter than your average gangster. They didn't play things by dishing out beatings and burying Joe loose lips in concrete or whatever these guys usually did. They specialized in fear. I heard later that their enforcers were nicknamed the Ghouls, and I can understand why. Their intimidation came in the style of scaring the absolute living crap out of their target, and their target was Tavaloris, not me. Unfortunately, it was still me and the kitchen girl from the night before, Elle, who made the discovery. Tavaloris had arranged for us to open up that next morning, too, maybe to test if I'd actually show up for work, get a vague scope of the situation. I did indeed show up to work, none the wiser, and explained to Elle as we entered the restaurant that the exterminator had been there the night before and laid down poison in the kitchen to deter rats. Now, Elle was young, probably too young to be running a kitchen, but she was whip smart, and immediately her face went whiter than usual as she told me, "Hey, that's not how an exterminator works. You can't just lay rat poison down in the kitchen where we prepare food." This was effed. We were probably going to have to dispose of any of the food the exterminator had access to. And thankfully that shouldn't have been very much since the pantry and the freezer were locked and Elle and another chef kept the key, but at the very least, we might have to replace some pans and some fresh veggies. That's a bummer, I thought as I opened the door. And then the next thing I'm doing is letting out the most high-pitched, girlish scream of my life. I slammed the door shut and began trembling, shaking like I was in septic shock. I could barely get my words out. I was almost sobbing, and bear in mind, I'm a grown-ass man. Elle was shaking me, asking me what the hell was wrong. Was someone dead in there? Did we have to call the cops? Now, she moved to open the kitchen door and I just about screamed no. I think I scared her more by grabbing her than anything else, at least until she looked through the window into the kitchen. To Elle's credit, she wasn't quite as freaked out as me, but she didn't suffer from crippling arachnophobia. You see, the thing is, the kitchen was absolutely filled with bugs. These were the same type of bugs, mostly around the same size, about 4 inches long maybe, and at first I thought they were spiders. But Elle, who was able to study them a bit more, pointed out that they had 10 legs and not 8. There were hundreds of them. They were just sort of milling around the kitchen, kind of just hanging out. And at first I couldn't believe that they were real. They looked like spiders by way of some messed up horror writer and then some, and this was freaking New Jersey, not the Australian outback or the Middle East. Things like this just didn't live here. House centipedes were bad enough, but seeing the kitchen of our restaurant filled with these monsters was enough to absolutely break me. I begged, pleaded with Elle to latch the door back up, and broke into a sobbing pile on the floor as she called Tavaloris. And the man himself showed up 10 minutes later, furious that we interrupted him. Of course, there weren't monster spiders in the kitchen. Maybe a handful had gotten in, sure, but we must have both lost it. I didn't even have time to tell him about the exterminator or yell for him not to enter the kitchen before he unlatched the door and stormed straight in. Now, I've never seen a fat, unfit man run quite so fast as I did then. Tavaloris came crashing out of the kitchen, hollering and howling, yelling at us for not telling him what to expect and cursing the redacted family who I don't want to draw the ire of even to today. Elle thankfully had the foresight to rush over and pull the door shut, locking it again. But not before a couple of these beasts had come ambling out into the restaurant. Elle somehow managed to trap one of them under a glass, and the others started coming towards me. It looked at me, and I looked at it. Its face looked like, well, let's just say it looked like lady parts. Somehow this made this hideous spider being a little less terrifying to me, and I couldn't really bring myself to kill it. And instead, I slowly backed away and let Elle capture that one too. But there was still the problem of the absolute hundreds of these horrible bugs in the kitchen. Tavaloris was just screaming, "No cops, no cops," and eventually calmed down enough to call an actual exterminator pal of his. Elle and I were sent home for the day, and the restaurant was closed for the next 3. Needless to say, I didn't return to work when my unpaid, I may add, vacation was over. I was done with that job. If Tavaloris had pissed off the redacted family, then I did not want to go between him and the ghouls. Now, this was their harmless warning, their opening gambit, so to speak. Things would escalate from here, and I wanted no part of that. Now, I later found out from Elle that the creatures were camel spiders. Not spiders at all, or were they scorpions, despite their other name of wind scorpion. They're wholly their own thing. Not really dangerous at all, but they do have a painful bite. But what creeped me out the most was that the ghouls had collected enough of these to release around 100 into our kitchen, and you could bet money that this wasn't the only stock of horrific creatures and creepy crawlies that they actually had. It made me sure of one thing. I didn't want to work in the service industry. I didn't want to work with anyone who messed with that redacted family or became the target of the ghouls. And I certainly didn't want to find out the kind of thing that they'd do to escalate if releasing 100 camel spiders into a restaurant was their initial warning. A few years later, long after I had moved out of New Jersey, I heard that Tavaloris restaurant had closed down, some kind of health inspection issue. Apparently it was really bad. A guest had found a baby bird fetus in their falafel or something. Whether this was another threat from the ghouls or just Tavaloris being a really terrible restaurant owner, I'll never know, and really, I never want to know.